Wow. Well, I want to thank you all very much. This is great. These are our friends. We have thousands of friends on this incredible movement. This was a movement like nobody's ever seen before. And frankly, this was, I believe, the greatest political movement of all time. There's never been anything like this in this country and maybe beyond.
Well, welcome, everybody. Glad to have you with us for Speak Up Virginia. Boy, what an exciting time to be alive in this nation. We can thank God for his mercy that he showed us on this nation. We are currently in the midst of what is probably the biggest political upset in generations. So there is a lot to talk about. Before we get started here, I'm just going to do a quick plug. If you want to make sure other people hear about this, make sure that you send them to our Speak Up Virginia playlist on YouTube and subscribe to Apple and Spotify and other avenues. It's great to get the word out because we're going to be talking about things that you are not hearing elsewhere. I think this is going to be unique perspective for you today. So I'm very glad to have with us to give our post-election day analysis, our very own President Victoria Cobb with the Family Foundation of Virginia. But we also have two very special guests from our sister organizations, family policy councils, in states that were considered very key battleground areas leading up to this, and that's North Carolina and Pennsylvania. So I'll start first with introducing John Rustin, President and Executive Director of the North Carolina Family Policy Council. And I see here, John, that you are a 25-year veteran of policy, social conservative movement, public policy arena in North Carolina. Welcome.
Hey, thank you, Candy. I guess you're just trying to age me, aren't you?
I am. I want you to come on another time. So, yeah. And then also, I am pleased to introduce Micheal Geer. He is the founding president and CEO of the Pennsylvania Family Insistute. Micheal has shaped many key policies in that state and nationally. Especially I saw, Micheal, that you were working on the school choice front in some unique ways. And before that, believe it or not, he was actually a producer at an NBC affiliate. Just had to throw that in there for fun. Mm-hmm. But also, I will just mention that Micheal and Victoria both serve on the national board for the Family Policy Alliance, which is a national network of, I guess you could say, pro-family organizations like ours. So they've got a unique view of the national landscape through that. So thank you, all of you. Welcome, Micheal, as well. Thank you, all of you, for taking some time today to do this.
Thank you. It's great to be on as someone introduced who used to work in the mainstream media and now is involved in politics. I feel that some people might be a little, does this guy have anything good to say? But anyway.
Well, the experience that you've had in what they call the legacy media actually leads me right into my first question here, because I am super curious about what your response is going to be to this, because I think we're all thinking for the last several months, even years, all we have been hearing about is how Trump is a fascist and the next Hitler. And here you have this groundbreaking election where he has made these unprecedented inroads with the Latino vote, the Black vote. He basically, it looks like, has a voter mandate. You know, we were taking the Senate, and at the time of this taping, it looks like we're on track for there to also to be a turnover in the House. So I don't think anyone can look at that and say this election was about discrimination like they're trying to make it. So here's my question. Where does that leave us with legacy media and the leftists, the hardcore leftists out there? What are they going to do? Are they going to have to recalibrate? Victoria, I'm going to throw that to you first, and then I want to go to the ex-NBC expert here.
I'm not going to lie that as soon as the conservative side starts winning an election, I quickly flip over to places like MSNBC and others where there are, gnashing of teeth and tears trying to figure out what in the world's going on. So I have been watching this reaction of legacy media. And I think it's interesting, you have your Jen Psaki, Biden sort of sympathizer, and then you've got, your Joy Reid, where it's just, and what's interesting is like, if you heard Jen Psaki, one of her first things was, well, this wasn't really a policy outcome. Like people don't really want different policy direction. And honestly, I think it's pretty clear they do. You didn't see Kamala distance herself from the Biden administration policies on economics and stuff, and people repudiated that soundly. So I think it's sort of ridiculous that she tried to say that. It was, they're reaching, and they're reaching hard. They're trying to say, and you're seeing this from a number of folks that really the college educated folks voted correctly. I feel like that's the underlying tone you're getting is like, if you just have an education, then obviously you voted right. But all these other uneducated, dumb voters, I don't know what they were thinking. And so they're still in some ways, in the way they're describing the outcome, sort of demeaning. And now we know more than half of the nation so far, I guess popular vote is still up for grabs, but I think we can say that they better be very careful how they're interpreting this. But I do think there's also a storyline in the alternative media. And I think that's really important to really think about the role that Elon Musk buying Twitter, now X, and the Joe Rogan podcast, which I just didn't realize had the reach that, they were talking about really nothing since Oprah Winfrey has been hitting that kind of an audience. So I think we really are also, another win for this election is that we're learning alternative media is actually getting to a lot of the audience. So I'm anxious to see how they continue to frame this, but also that the American people aren't going to just listen to the way legacy media frames it. They're going to be looking at other sources too.
Yeah, Michael, I'm really curious to hear your perspective. Is legacy media irrelevant now, or do you think they'll try to adjust?
I don't know that they have it within them to adjust because they're ideologically committed, which is not necessarily what I had experienced in my career previous to working at Pennsylvania Family Institute. Certainly, there were people on the left or a little bit on the liberal side of things, but there was a sense that journalism should be treated with some level of respect or sanctity, if you will. That being unbiased or at least trying to be unbiased was important. And a service to the public and to the consumers of the news media. That has been thrown out the window, and some of that has to do with what's going on our college campuses and what they're being taught at the Columbia School of Journalism or at the University of Missouri or these other places. And we find that in the coverage that we get at Pennsylvania Family Institute and the work that we do with the younger so-called journalists or people, whether it's local newspaper reporters or TV reporters or whatever, those that are just out of college or whatever, seem much more ideologically bent to be activists towards a particular purpose. So whether they can learn from this, I'm not quite sure. The other part of it is and we're seeing this in Pennsylvania, I don't know, what the experience is in Virginia, North Carolina, is a lot of these legacy newspapers now are asking for financial donations to keep doing the work because the commercial opportunities for newspapers, for example, selling advertising and even TV and radio, with the exception of election season, of course, they all make tons of money. But besides that, because of social media and the other sources for news, the economic model for the news business is kind of evaporated. And so then if you have donors coming in that might have some ideological commitment, we'll give you, and you see these leftist newspapers happening, getting these funding from these leftist sources tilts the coverage all the more. So that may be more deep than people were looking for, but I don't see it changing significantly. I'll say one other thing, just though. There was a momentary awakening from some of the people that I watched on the news last night and this morning. Joe Scarborough, who was calling himself a conservative, which is absolutely absurd, but he was saying, people might accuse me of being a white conservative, and this is why I have this view. But he said, I went out to dinner. Mika and I went out to dinner a lot of times with Democrats who are concerned about the girls' sports issue and concerned about boys being in the girls' bathroom. And he said, I think that polls at 85%. And the Democrats have not paid attention to that. The news media doesn't cover it. So that was a minor awakening, but I'm not putting Joe Scarborough in the conservative camp by any stretch of the imagination. I heard the same thing from Harold Ford last night on Fox News, the Democrat commentator from Tennessee, who was saying the same thing. The girls' sports transgender issue was pretty big, and the news media ignored it.
Yeah, and as Victoria pointed out, this election really showed the power of alternative media with Joe Rogan and all of that, and the whole podcast world. I mean, both candidates were going to the podcasters.
Yeah.
And John, I'd love your thoughts on, as we see more segmentation happening and people choosing media according to their views or their interests. How do you think that's going to play? How do you think social conservatives can navigate where this is going? How can we work within what's becoming the new reality, or even is the reality now?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I couldn't agree more with what Victoria and Michael have said. I think the mainstream media has become they've lost journalistic integrity, and they become activists and but basically are lobbying for a particular cause or message. And we see that in the polling. We see that in the responses that they have when things are going, elections may be moving in a direction that they don't like. And they start seemingly fabricating news stories that help to push a narrative that they're interested in pushing. So I think the general public has become aware of that. The Christian community certainly has become more and more aware of that. And I hate to encourage people to be overly skeptical, but I think that we need to, as we're consuming information, especially from the mainstream media and other sources, that we need to be skeptical about those sources, what their agenda may be, and really consider those factors because they are major movers and means of influence in our culture, and they're driving so much. We saw this, and not to go too far off on a rabbit trail, but we saw this so dramatically back in 2016. Your listeners and viewers may remember the so-called bathroom bill, or HB2, in North Carolina. We used to have a great relationship with the Capitol Press Corps, the media down at the General Assembly, and really worked with them a lot because there was journalistic integrity. And when they were reporting on legislative matters, they felt that it was important. It was valuable to have balance in their stories, of course, with an expected level of bias, but, balance in their stories, and representation of both sides of an issue. And with HB2, what happened is they just went off the rails, and they really lost any semblance of journalistic integrity and ended up basically reporting the talking points of the Human Rights Campaign and Equality North Carolina and activist groups on these particular matters. And so we've just seen that grow more and more and more, not only on the state level on policy issues, but on the national scene, and especially when it comes to political campaigns, like just what we've gone through with this election. And so when things are not going the way that they like it, when the narrative is not consistent with their agenda, then they start twisting the story. And again, I think, to answer your question, Christians have got to be aware of this. They've got to be skeptical. They've got to go, as they're looking at information and collecting resources, do so with their eyes wide open. And just don't take what the mainstream media says at face value. We've got to always be considerate and run what we're hearing through a filter of truth, and especially as we seek to approach the world with a biblical worldview, to fundamentally get down to that basis of what the Bible says, and then kind of build a perspective on top of that as it applies to how those things relate to our culture.
Yeah, and I'm hoping coming out of this that there will be more power for social conservatives to really shape their own storyline. And speaking of powerful storylines, one thing I briefly mentioned was another big wake-up call coming out of this, and that was Trump getting 45% of the Latino vote, expanding with the Black vote among Black voters. Michael, how did you see this playing out in Pennsylvania? I know it sounds like Kamala didn't get the expected turnout in some of the urban areas.
No, absolutely not. And we have on our staff, I have a couple of bilingual Hispanic members, one that does specific outreach to the Hispanic community, and the other is our communications director. And so they've been on the ground quite a bit working with pastors and talking about the issue. And one of them is Puerto Rican, the other's from a Cuban background. So even there's diversity in the Latino community. But what I think is interesting here is that the issues that the Democrats were looking at all these different demographics and sort of thinking we can appeal to this specific demographic by talking about this, or that demographic by talking about that, the sort of identity politics way of doing things. Whereas what I think really made the day was that I think the Republicans said, we're all Americans, and we're going to be talking about the things that anybody who loves this country and cares about this country, including those who are Hispanic or Black for that matter, or whatever, caring about jobs, caring about the border, caring about the cost of groceries, all of these sorts of things, and the social issues as well, as we've talked about here, treating everybody like we're just Americans and we're voters. And I think that's what played out here in Pennsylvania. And, as we've talked about the media and sort of the bias and the lies, if you will, that they talked about, it's as if people had, earplugs in their ears. They were not buying it. And so that was true. I think what I heard reported back from our folks that were doing Latino outreach, they just said, the Puerto Rican issue, which the news media, the joke that was told at the Madison Square Garden, that didn't impact the vote really at all. I saw one of the two employees at our things mentioned that Puerto Rico elected a new governor in this election, and there's a Republican. So who knows? But that's kind of what we saw on the ground here, is that the identity politics and dividing communities based on class, race, ethnics, whatever, is not what Americans are looking for these days.
Yeah, I love that.
Michael.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
I was going to say, Michael makes such a great point, because it seems like when these moments happen, like the joke that, that was not appropriate and not helpful, but like when those things happen, what's very interesting is it seems like the white elite college class, that group of people is more offended actually than the actual group that the joke was aimed at. And I find that fascinating, that there's sort of this over offense by a different segment, and the liberals bank on that and they apply it to whatever group was actually insulted. It's just not working. It's not, there's not a real change in vote there.
Yeah.
I love the thought that they were trying to make it about identity politics this whole time, but actually, diverse communities care about their families just like the rest of us. John, to that point, did you see any of this playing out in Georgia? Were there any thoughts you had on this based on what you guys saw?
Well, I think we saw similarly, and we're still digging into the election results to kind of understand things better, but definitely saw Blacks and Hispanic voters coming out more in favor of Trump. I think that's what what the way that Trump just, and he came in, I mean, he was in North Carolina seemingly every day, or he or JD Vance, and it was just rallies after rallies, and very diverse group of folks attending these rallies, just really on board with the campaign. And so I think that really translated a lot. One other thing that we saw in North Carolina too, which was very, very encouraging, was that, of course, the western part of our state was hit extremely hard by the Hurricane Helene. We had 25 counties that were really devastated by that, and we had near record turnout for this election. And so the turnout was at 73%, and the next highest turnout we had was in the 2020 election at 75%, and that's the highest that it's been in 4 decades in North Carolina. And a lot of that, some of the especially the early voting took place in some of those most western counties. The state made accommodations for that. But I share all that to say that we just saw a real fervor of commitment to get out and vote, but also to get out and vote for Trump. Trump won North Carolina in 2020 by about 75,000 votes. He won this election by almost 200,000 votes. So we had a great level of turnout. And also just a really high level of interest and intensity. And I think that intensity, kind of goes across the racial voting spectrum. And so that's exciting to see that. And I think a lot has to deal with the messages that you talked about that were, that were given by the Trump campaign and others in the Republican Party in North Carolina.
Yeah. Now, I know, Victoria, a trend that you noticed as well is that it seemed like Trump was also reaching people under 30. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, there's clearly some evidence that there is movement among our youngest voters. The Democrats always used to count on, those first voters, the college age, if we could just turn out all the college campuses. And young men in particular are starting to reject the notion that they show up on a college campus and they're automatically a Democrat. They're automatically voting liberal. Some of them are the audience of these podcasts that are reaching, people beyond the legacy media. So, these kids are listening to Joe Rogan and some of these others, and they're going, wait a second. I think there's also an overreaction. I don't want to say overreaction, an appropriate aggressive reaction to the feminization of culture, to the idea that, that we have to elevate women over men, that we have to put this big emphasis on LGBT. We're seeing some movement there, and this election showed it. And I think that was pretty substantial. I can't tell you exactly the final numbers, how that will shake out, as they're still doing some counting and where it's located. But I think the days of assuming that everybody goes to college and is automatically liberal may be done. And what's really exciting about that, and this is really has been a struggle for the conservative vote for a long time, is people's first vote is often how they vote for several election cycles. So capturing that audience when they make their first vote, those 18-year-olds, those young, typically men, that could serve us well if we steward it well over the next several elections. So that is definitely something we saw in this election.
All right. I just want to get real quick to one of the biggest stories of the night, and that was on the abortion amendments. And we had an encouraging surprise with more, I think, more positive movement that a lot of people were projecting. Of course, the biggest story were these two states where we had the first states flat out rejecting a very broad constitutional amendment, that would have put in unlimited abortion. So we have something out of the gate, finally, states saying no to this. So, of course, that was Florida and Nebraska. I want to hear all of your thoughts on this. I know there in total were 10 amendments, and we had victories in those two states. What do you think were the key takeaways in those victories? And what do you see as the work that we have moving forward? John, I'll start out with you.
Well, we did not have one of these amendments in North Carolina, but I think the work moving forward definitely is that we have a tremendous amount of work to do. I think that what we saw in North Carolina related to this were the high level points that were being made in a lot of these campaigns, and the attack ads were based on life and complete misconceptions and misguided ads about where certain candidates stood on the issue of life, if they were pro-life, that they want to ban everything all the time, and just outrageous claims that are just untrue. I think a lot of people have been persuaded by that. I know those tactics were used in states that had these life amendments on the ballot. And again, like we talked about earlier, I think it's really important that the Christian community is educated and aware of, the issue of life, the fundamental value of life, why we need to value life. And we really need to get back to the fundamentals about that. But also, as that applies to the current culture and the narratives that are being pushed, that we need to be very clear about what proposals are, what they mean, and that these extreme claims just oftentimes are absolutely untrue. And folks need to be knowledgeable about that so that we can engage the culture. And even as you're talking with members of your family, folks in your neighborhood, even people at church, we need to be speaking with educated and truthful minds and hearts about this issue.
Victoria, you want to jump in there?
Yeah, sure. There's so much to say about this because, of course, this is on our hearts and minds as the Family Foundation, as we're watching. And yes, 10 states, the word on the street, if you had asked most people, legacy media, everybody kind of the day before, it was they're all going to, we're going to lose on every front. So getting some wins was really significant. And I'll just mention, a couple facts about them. I think Florida in particular is really important because Florida you got to understand first that Florida was a 60% threshold. So it wasn't a straight majority vote. And every state is a little different about that. But the important part here is they were outspent 10-1. $120 million was used to spread lies about the amendment. And that is an amazing feat to be able to win under that kind of money pressure. But really, one of the keys was Governor DeSantis. Governor DeSantis went all in on this amendment and really helped the pro-life side. He leveraged his political capital. He was everywhere about it. And so a lot of Florida conservative movement is thanking him this morning. And so I think that's a big takeaway, is that when you have a governor that leans in correctly, you can bring a state along. Nebraska was a very tight, and they had an unusual situation where they had two things on their ballot at the same time. So sort of a positive and a negative is, I guess, the best way to describe it. One thing that, would be from the pro-life community, and one was a pro-abortion amendment. And so it's amazing that they were able to win. And so now they have constitutionalized a 12-week ban. So that's really significant. And then I think you have to note that even some of the states that lost, there's actually great progress there. So Missouri barely lost. I mean, that was so close. And also in New York, when the state of New York, a very blue state, comes up with a percentage that is not very different than Florida, a very red state, we have really gained ground, and they've learned something about messaging, because you wouldn't expect the same result in Florida and New York. Now, because the threshold was 60% in Florida, it's a win for the pro-life side, and the threshold was not 60% in New York. And so we do have this dilemma that's just a reality that says we can't, one's a win, one's a loss. But I think it's really significant. Maybe we're learning some things about how to successfully share with the electorate what these are really about.
I want to jump in here as well, because there was a third state that had a pro-life victory, and that was South Dakota. Which was not specifically expected necessarily. And so that is, I feel like the tide is starting to turn on this issue, that, it was almost a slam dunk and expected that the abortion side would win because of the amount of money that they're putting into it, because of the lies and scare tactics that they use. But the other thing to point out in it, besides, I think it's a turning point and gives the pro-life movement something to build upon here, is with those three victories, is that in a number of these states, they have these on the ballots not only to enshrine abortion into constitutions, but they thought it was going to turn out the vote to the benefit of Democrat candidates in the presidential race on down. And that didn't prove to be the case. We look at these states, whether it's Florida or, which again, it was a majority that did vote for this abortion amendment, even though they needed the 60%, so it lost. But the overwhelming vote in Florida was for the red team, if you will. Same thing in these other states, Missouri and others, Josh Hawley coming to an easy victory. So the notion that abortion has coattails is not the case. And so I see it as a turning point. And we even see that here in Pennsylvania with some of the local or the congressional races. One, the 10th district race, Scott Perry versus the incumbent versus a challenger, former TV anchor here. Scott Perry was just declared the winner in that. That was among the top targets of the Democrats to flip that congressional seat to the D's, and they focused on the abortion issue. Scott Perry did not shrink away from standing for his pro-life convictions, and people saw through that, and that there was a victory, an unexpected victory for a pro-life candidate there when abortion and tons of money for the pro-abortion side was played. So I do see we have a lot of work to do. There's no question about it, but I do see some real positives in these three wins and then what's happened in these other places.
All right. Good news. We have Cole Muzio joining us. Can you hear us, Cole?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes. Thank you for joining us. We won't ask if you're actually driving or not. We'll just remain ignorant.
I pulled over for the great people of the Commonwealth of Virginia.
Okay. Thank you. Well, let me just quickly introduce you and let you jump in here. So as I said, we have Cole Muzio, founder and president of Frontline Policy Council. Over the last half decade, Cole has played a major role in shaping politics and policy and really the dialogue around conservative issues in the Georgia Capitol and in winning elections in Georgia. And so I'm glad you're able to jump in. We were just in the middle of talking about some of the unexpected wins on abortion last night with two states, Florida, Nebraska, and Michael was just sharing there was another win that people aren't as
South
aware of in
Dakota.
South Dakota.
Yeah, South Dakota.
Yeah. And then I guess there was also Victoria, you told me about West Virginia.
Yeah, there's some other interesting on the life note. West Virginia had a constitutional amendment, so they have now successfully changed their constitution to prohibit assisted suicide. So that's something we fight here in Virginia, and is also needs to be noted as a pro-life win, just at the other end of the life spectrum.
So my question, Cole, I'll throw it to you since you're just jumping on here. What are the takeaways for our path forward? You know, they were just discussing the difference it made when governors leaned in, and Nebraska having a situation where there were two different choices on the ballot. What are some practical applications we can take moving forward on the life issue, and what might be some encouragement to the states where, you know, maybe it wasn't as a big of a blowout as was projected, but, you know, still they didn't win. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, and first of all, thank you for the kind introduction, and thank you all for your patience with me and hopping on late. I hopped on late because I'm not half as big of a deal as Micheal Geer is, so I wanted y'all to be able. But yeah, so definitely, I mean, for the first time since Dobbs, some encouraging wins for the life issue, and so great to see those be standalone wins in some of these states where you had the measure and then it gets voted for. But let me tell you a little bit about something that happened in Georgia that I think is a really good takeaway. First of all, in 2022, you saw Brian Kemp go from a 52,000 point win against Stacey Abrams, which Stacey Abrams, contrary to her belief, did lose that governor's race in 2018. But he won by 52,000 votes. He then signed Heartbeat into law into 2019. And you fast forward to 2022 after Dobbs, he wins by over 300,000 votes and over 8 percentage points. Brian never once backed away from the definition of life. He never once shied away from the heartbeat bill. He wasn't running ads on, hey, reelect me because I signed the heartbeat into law. But he was very clear Georgia's a state that valued life. And accompanying that, he's been a leader on fighting against human trafficking, for adoption and foster care, and kind of building a case for a pro-life ethos. And so people see consistency there. And so fast forward to this election, I'm going to tell you about Scott Hilton, who's a state rep from North Metro Atlanta. His district was considered to be the second most likely Republican district to flip. It was thought he's going to need to outperform Donald Trump by just a handful of percentage points in order to win. He had voted for the life issue. He was being attacked for having signed the Georgia Right to Life absolutist pledge several years prior, which is, you know, hey, he's going to no exceptions was kind of his stated platform that he was being attacked on. But Scott won his race 55-45 last night. It was a 10-point win. He was the number one target that Planned Parenthood and the leftist groups want to take out. But Scott didn't shy away from the life issue. But Scott has sponsored bill after bill to support children with special needs, to go after human trafficking, to support adoption and foster care. And that holistic message where you don't shy away from it, but you instead make it part of who you are. It's not just about abortion. You're pro-life, legitimately pro-life, and it's part of your message and part of your belief system. That's a winner. And so I think that's going to be key for candidate and organization messages moving forward.
Well, you know, I think it's interesting also that you had just this movement on abortion, and people were saying that this was a gender issue, that they were expecting huge turnout on the issue with women, but it looked like maybe they didn't get as much as the women as they were thinking on this issue, or that being such a big movement with all women, and then Trump expanding at the same time with men. What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, especially the number of black men that he got, you know, in Georgia, which is, you know, that's a key demographic, got 25% of the vote with black men in the state of Georgia. I mean, that's a huge margin. And I think it goes to show, again, you know, you should not let abortion just be kind of a standalone issue. But if you can build into kind of an overall ethos of life, and particularly the transgender issue is one that is driving a lot of these people into our camp. When you're able to say boys are boys and girls are girls, and we're made in the image of God, it becomes part of your overall package. And I care about your family. I'm going to reduce your taxes. I'm going to make sure you don't pay as much for groceries. And you package that with a whole message. You don't have to compromise on life because you're not picking up those rabid pro-abortion voters by sounding more moderate on the life issue. You pick up moderate pro-abortion voters because you're conservative on things that they care about. And I think that's a message that we saw across the state is women voters who may be pro-abortion, they still are also pro-low mortgage payments and pro-low cost groceries, and they don't want boys going into their daughters' locker rooms. And so when you can make a strong case to them on other issues, the rabid single issue pro-abortion voters, you're never going to get in your corner. But if you can build a comprehensive case on other issues, they'll come to you.
Yeah.
I think what you just said, Cole, is so key. I saw some exit poll, interviewing. So a guy on the ground that had been asking people at the polls, why'd you vote? How'd you vote? All this stuff. And he really said a big difference in the answer is going to come from whether a woman is wearing a wedding ring or not. Mm-hmm. And if you look at the demographic, one of the big sort of takeaways was sort of the 45 to 60. And I think, when you look at, I think women who are moms who are in households that are raising children, exactly what Cole said. They're paying the bills, they're buying the eggs, they're buying the gas, they understand that. And abortion does not need to be there. They don't feel that somehow trumps something else. But the liberal left was counting on abortion trumping all other issues for all women. And that's just not the case, which is, I think, important. Now we've got a lot of work to do to make it the case to be pro-life for a lot more women in the future.
Did y'all see that ad that Harris was pushing towards the end of the women that go into the polling place with their husbands and, vote for Kamala. And it's like, it's a secret that they're keeping. I mean, I found it to be so demeaning.
Absolutely. As a woman, I thought that was very demeaning.
I mean,
it's certainly not pro-marriage either. We'd like to believe that we share things with our spouse, even if we disagree on things.
Yeah.
I'm going to go on the record and say it's the opposite. It's usually us women that are really bugging our husbands about.
They make this case about strong women and who they're going to vote for. And then they depict these total weak women that aren't willing to tell their husband or try to persuade their husband. The whole campaign for Harris, and this is one of the things where I think she fell down, is it was like she was campaigning to this weird stereotype of people that don't exist.
Yeah.
Idea that Tim Walz is this tough, manly football coach, and then you see him walking around flapping his arms like a duck. It was a weird, quixotic campaign to people that aren't really around, except kind of this beta male college campus culture, and that's a very small segment of the vote. So it was a weird push for her all around.
Well, speaking of the kind of the cray that maybe they went a little too far on with the messaging, I did want to bring up the transgender issue, especially since you brought it in, Cole. I really want to hear your thoughts on how much did that play into tipping this over? And, I was thinking about today, even with Biden administration, having really some of these just outrageous people that are pretty out there in his administration. And you just wonder if that people are seeing this, there's the girls' sports issue, just women's safety issues, the children being pushed into surgeries. How much do you think that played in to this being a historic election win? Michael, I'll start off with you.
Well, I think, there was a pretty powerful ad that was, I think, the Trump campaign or one of their surrogates or whatever that ended with, she's for they, them, and he's for you. And I think that was an understanding of that large segment of the population, whether you're Democrat, Republican, or whatever. If you have a daughter playing in sports, or you have a daughter at school, or a mom who's going to the gym or whatever, you don't want the agenda that is coming out of Title IX changes that the Biden administration pushed. You don't want to see that happen. And so I think it was a big factor. And as I mentioned earlier, Joe Scarborough talked about it because the people that he was running into, Democrats going out to dinner, talked about I have a daughter at home, and I don't want her to encounter this thing or be endangered or lose a trophy or a scholarship because of some boy took her place on the sports team. So it was a big issue.
John, what do you think about with the voters in North Carolina?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think the Democrats were hitting on a lot of these hot button issues and trying to, nail Republicans over and over again with it. One of those issues that resonated so much is the gender issue, that how the Trump campaign was, as Michael said, with that particular ad, pairing Kamala Harris with, the drag queens and other individuals, that it really just it played strongly to a conservative base and a family-oriented base in North Carolina that is very offended by the notion that boys are not boys and girls are not girls, but they can be whatever they want to be. And so I think the message really resonated strongly. I was frankly a bit surprised to see how early the Trump campaign was putting out those ads and how consistently they did. But I think based on that they had obviously done some polling and found that that issue was one that resonated significantly with voters. And so they continue to harp on it. And I think it was incredibly successful.
I think it's important, though, as we are at this juncture with, we saw election victories, et cetera, that the engagement of citizens now to encourage the politicians who ran ads or made promises or whatever on these issues to actually take action on it.
Amen.
Because oftentimes we've seen it in the past where campaigns are run on a particular issue, but then they take office and then it gets put on the shelf. And we need to engage in so many different ways with organizations like those represented here in the different states to encourage our legislators, whether in Washington, D.C. or in our state capitals, to be acting on these issues. And in our school boards as well, with elections here in Pennsylvania, school board elections next year, those are vitally important on these issues that so many Pennsylvanians and Americans care about.
Along those,
Michael,
go ahead, Victoria.
I was just going to say, Michael, you make such a good point. And the reason this is so important, Michael and John, I know for sure were sitting in this room. I can't remember, Cole, you were there yet, but when Trump won the first time, we were able to be brought in a little bit and have a little bit of a briefing as the new administration took over. And they literally described the sort of their work in dealing with the transgender LGBT stuff as whack-a-mole. It's like everywhere they turned around, there had been these regulations that had been altered, non-discrimination terms or gender terms. And unfortunately, that's going to be it again. They're going to walk in now. We've had 4 years of the Biden-Kamala Harris administration where they've been altering these definitions on sex and gender. They've been tweaking these regs. And so we've got a new administration that's going to walk in and we're going to have to remind them, we need that done again. We need all of this put back. And that was part of how they won. So Michael makes a really great point. And I think we're going to have a big moment when they take office.
So people listening to this coming out of a high with this election, what's the most important thing they can start doing right now on the ground in their neighborhoods? Or even just emailing people federally, their representatives. Anybody want to take that one?
Let me give you a really practical example that I think everyone listening at home can do. You can get a hold of your state representative. You can invite them to coffee or lunch. I promise you, your state leader will not turn down a free meal from you. So invite them to coffee or lunch and encourage them to take state action on one of these issues. Sponsor a bill. Do something. Save girls' sports. Keep boys out of girls' bathrooms, locker rooms. Something on this issue. And build a relationship with that person. So make it a personal ask where you've bought them a meal, you've prayed for them, you've gotten to know them. Because so much of the federal government, Trump's going to come in, he's going to have a transition team. There's going to be a game plan. They're going to try to execute it. But we see these movements start in states. The reason Save Girls Sports is becoming a thing is because states started to take action and there became a wave, and it allowed for the Trump campaign to run that ad, which, by the way, doesn't just hit people that are transgenderism is their number one issue. It's people who, for the economy is their number one issue. And they're going, hey, my family's hurting. And Kamala Harris is spending her time trying to take my tax dollars and apply it to reassignment surgeries for prisoners. Like, it may not show up in exit polling how much that ad moved the needle, but it moved it in a profound way. but that was possible because of work done in states, one state rep at a time. You can't build a relationship necessarily with your congressman. You may never know you're a United States senator, and you may not ever be in the room and have a chance to bend Donald Trump's ear. But you can meet your state representative who can then sponsor a bill and it starts a wave nationally. And so take that action. Don't just, send them an angry email or encourage them to vote on something that already exists. Build a relationship with that person and ask them to do something very specific.
Yeah,
Candy, I completely agree with that. I think Cole is absolutely right. And now is a perfect time. I mean, let the dust settle a little bit after the election, but these individuals have been campaigning for your vote. They've been asking for you to support them and to vote for them. And now is a perfect time to reach out to them. As Cole said, start to build a relationship with them. Even start with, hey, I appreciate your interest and willingness to serve. Can I come pray for you? And I'd like to build a relationship and just uphold you in prayer. But it's also a perfect time to reiterate some of these issues and the interest that voters have, that citizens have in the issues that were put out there during this campaign, and then start to hold these elected officials accountable. So again, now is a perfect time. They've been asking for your vote. Now is the time where you can go appeal to them to start to build that relationship if you don't have one already, and let them know what's important to you.
Candy, let me just add one thing that's sort of an exclamation point on what these guys are saying, which is that they are aware that they have lost, the liberals. They are aware that they all lost ground, even if the state went blue, even if, in our case, there were things that we wish had been even stronger in conservative directions. And the reason I say this really matters is because I watched the Twitter, the X responses of Senator Danica Rome in our state. This is the transgender senator that we have. So obviously LGBT issue, very big, important issue for this individual. And the response was noting every place Democrats had lost ground. And then it says, we have to take this seriously. So there's an acknowledgement, even among people who we dramatically disagree on this agenda, that there is loss and they have to do something. And we need to convince them that something is to get back to the values we all share.
Mm-hmm. What I love about this, all of you on this call, is each of you represent these state level organizations that will put the power behind the people listening, put the power behind your voices. And, when you mentioned praying for representatives, I just want to mention that in a lot of states, we have the Church Ambassador Network, and this would be a key time to start making those introductions. So I just want to put in that plug that each Family Policy Council on this call has support systems in place for people to be able to make the most of their voice. So we're going to put all of the websites in the show notes, but I just want to throw that out there real quick.
Thank you, Candy.
Does anyone else, before we move on here, does anyone else want to comment on any other amendments out there? I know we had some stuff happening on marijuana and other things. Any other comments on the ballot initiative?
Well, I'll talk briefly about Florida and the defeat of the marijuana amendment there. Governor DeSantis also was a hero, if I can use that term, in fighting the putting marijuana. Legalization of commercial sale of marijuana in Florida was a ballot initiative that lost there as well. That gives us hope here in Pennsylvania because our governor, Josh Shapiro, who has become famous across the country, has been pushing legalization of marijuana. It can't be done through the ballot here in Pennsylvania. It has to be done through the legislature. And so we'll be taking lessons out of Florida on how to message on that issue so that we can defeat it here in Pennsylvania and protect our state in that regard.
Excellent. All right. Real quick, wanted to hear from each of you. What were the biggest takeaways? Is there anything you want to highlight coming out of your state that would help people to know nationally, just that maybe are lessons learned or movement, one direction or the other? I'll go ahead and start with you, Cole. Anything you want to highlight coming out of Election Day?
Ooh. There's just no drama ever in the state of Georgia, so it's difficult to come up with something. Look, I'll just kind of go there. Donald Trump almost lost the election when he went into Georgia and he blasted Brian Kemp. Let me just point out what I think is the best example of Christian statesmanship in the country, period. Donald Trump has spent the last 4 years targeting Brian Kemp and his family. You can go into whether any of that was justified or not. We may have some different opinions of folks listening on this podcast. Brian Kemp at no point responded in kind. He kept his focus on what is good for the people that he serves and what is good for the principles by which he espouses. When Donald Trump attacked his family in the state of Georgia, the harshest thing Brian Kemp said in response was, "Leave my family out of your mouth." Donald Trump eventually came back to Georgia, said Brian Kemp's a great governor. I love him now. It's what problem has ever existed between the two of us, and kind of came back to the table and rebuilt some bridges. Again, I want to highlight that you had a governor who cared enough about the people that he serves and the cause and the king that he serves that he did not want to disrupt and create issues of divide. And a big reason that Donald Trump won the state of Georgia is that you have a popular governor who has 67% approval rating in the state of Georgia, gave his network, his infrastructure to try to elect a president who he didn't like personally and who'd attacked him personally because the cause mattered more than the personality. And so take that as an example of inspiration for someone that set aside a lot of personal grievance, a lot of personal baggage to say, I love this country, I love my people, I love my responsibility, I love my God and the principles by which I'm called to espouse and fight for more than I love myself.
Well, we saw that storyline in a lot of different places. I mean, you can give an example with Governor Youngkin and even Megyn Kelly, like a personality, coming out to support him. And I would say even JD Vance, we all know that he had. So that was there was a storyline there. But what is it about in your state, Cole, that you think brought out these new voters that Trump was key in bringing out more of a diverse vote? Because we were talking about that earlier, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on the Latino and the Black vote, especially as it applied in Georgia.
Yeah, I think it's a trend. Brian did a great job with Latinos and with Hispanics in particular, and he got good showing with Black male voters in 2022. And so Trump was able to build on that. I think you do see a realignment where the Democrat Party is increasingly campaigning to the gay vote and the uber educated, uber wealthy white suburban woman, and that is not a long-term win play for them. A lot of people over the years, a lot of Republicans have fallen into the trap of demographics as doom. There is great hope and opportunity in that. God's kingdom is diverse. It is colorful. And one of the things that is attracting Black and Hispanic voters is they see a movement of pro-family people that recognize basic truth and basic reality and who cares about them more. And when you look at how detached Kamala Harris's campaign was from reality, and you have got Tampon Tim as her running mate, it became a thing where these voters that care about family, they care about truth, they care about hard work and what that means. They didn't all of a sudden realign their economic policy to Donald Trump, but they know what truth is. They go and they read the same scripture that we do, and they know God didn't make 17 different genders. So some of the this progress, it's a trend line. We saw it in 2022, we saw it somewhat in 2020, and it built on that in 2024.
And just to clarify, Tampon Tim is a reference, I think, to putting tampons in boys' bathrooms in schools. Is that what you're?
Exactly.
Yes. In case anyone wasn't aware.
Policy.
Yeah. So, Michael, I'll jump to you. Any chance coming into maybe what's your next General Assembly session that things might be flipped somewhat, or what's going on?
I think so. It's the Senate is going to stay in Republican hands as the vote count has come in. The House of Representatives, there are some tight races that has been under Democrat control just for this last session, but just by one vote. It may flip back to Republican, but we don't know that as we speak right now. And we obviously have Josh Shapiro as our governor. And what's notable about him, obviously, is that everybody thought if Kamala Harris had chosen him as the vice presidential nominee, Pennsylvania would have been in the bag. He's kind of a popular governor. People don't know that he's not as moderate as he is characterized to be. Very much. I mean, probably if you look at his tweets over his tenure since he's been governor, about every seventh tweet is about abortion, promoting abortion. He recently passed or had a resolution declaring the last week of October as Asexual Awareness Week. I don't know what that means,
Wow.
but so watching Josh Shapiro is going to be kind of an interesting thing because he has spoken out in support of school choice. If he wants to moderate, because everybody knows he wants to be president. Actually, one of our colleagues has a friend who went to school with him back in Pennsylvania, back when he was in fifth grade, and said back in fifth grade, Josh Shapiro said he was going to be the first Jewish president in the United States. Mm-hmm. So he's had that ambition for a long time. School choice has been something that he promoted, but then he vetoed his own language in this negotiated language in this last budget, prohibiting the expansion of school choice. So he's all over the map. That's something we're going to be watching and hope that he moderates more for the benefit of us passing things like robust school choice here in Pennsylvania.
Victoria, I have to ask you now, is Youngkin going to be in the new administration? I'm just going to put you on the spot right there.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of belief that the next step for Governor Youngkin is in a cabinet post in the Trump administration. So that's going to be interesting for Virginians to watch. If that hands out, some folks are talking education because, of course, he wrote into the governorship on parental rights and education. He's also a businessman, so commerce gets thrown out. And so, yes, that is the general rumor mill in Virginia, and that's puts in a series of other events, which would mean our Lieutenant Governor, Winsome Sears, would then become governor for this last year. And that would change the way our governor race rolls out in 2025. So we're rolling, Virginia election every year. So we're rolling right into our next election starting today. And that will be in November. And so she would kind of roll in as an incumbent governor. That changes the scenario right now, it looks like, against Abigail Spanberger, former Congresswoman. So, yeah, we have a lot of things that are kind of spiraling as a result of the potential of what this election has done.
Very
Would
interesting.
Donald Trump have a cabinet member that was taller than him?
I think maybe as long as you just don't, put them side by side all the time, I think he'll be okay with it.
Yeah.
Trump can wear the yellow jacket and Youngkin can wear the red jacket. It'll be fine.
The vest, the Youngkin vest.
Yeah. Since this is a Speak Up Virginia podcast, Victoria, you want to throw out anything especially encouraging for our Virginia voters to be aware of coming out of this, or at least as it looks?
Yeah, I think it's important for folks. I mean, of course, we're disappointed we don't get to put, a red conservative stamp on our state, but it's important to understand we are moving in the right direction. We have every race since 2020, we've gotten more red. And that's important because it's a trend. It's a movement. It's little by little. And, even those in the Northern Virginia suburbs can be encouraged. Fairfax, Loudoun, their numbers of conservative votes pulled back towards what they were in 2021. They got closer to the Youngkin sort of, we call it the high water mark, as of conservatism. And so there's even encouragement there. I think the big takeaway for Virginia is the size and scope of federal government. It continues to be such a problem for us. We need the government to shrink. We need Donald Trump, if he's serious about eliminating government waste, we need him to reduce the size of government so that we have fewer liberal workers in our state taking up domicile and voting. And that has, because we know that has crept all the way down into the 7th congressional district, which we were hoping to pick up, is still being counted as we speak, but looks like we will not have a conservative pull out there. And that is largely because we now have all these government employees living all the way down in Stafford and in, those lower sort of upper Fredericksburg suburbs for those that are watching this not from Virginia. So the takeaway is we've got work to do, but be encouraged. We are fully a swing state. I know that it could feel discouraging, but we came back. Our numbers improved. Our numbers this year are much closer to 2016 than they were to 2020 in terms of the vote for a more conservative ideology.
That's a double whammy of a demographic, someone that works in the federal government and they would make the life choice to live in Stafford and drive all the way to DC. You can't trust that person to vote. I'm just telling you.
That comes from Cole, not Victoria. John, real quick, what's your most encouraging takeaways from North Carolina?
Yeah, Candy, I would just say, first of all, just how resonant the message is to Christians, how important it is for them to get out and vote, that it's part of us being salt and light in the culture. It's part of us being civically engaged, is that we have to get out and vote. And an example of how important that is, in North Carolina in the 2021-22 legislative session, Republicans held the North Carolina legislature, both chambers, the House and the Senate, but the governor was Democrat. The governor vetoed like 22 different bills that session. The Republicans were one seat short in the House of having a veto-proof supermajority, and they could not override any of the governor's vetoes. Then in 2023, the makeup of the House and the Senate were pretty much the same, except in the House, they were one seat short of a veto-proof supermajority. We had a Democrat who switched parties from Democrat to Republican because she had been so mistreated by the Democratic Party that she came over. And by virtue of that one shift in a seat in the legislature, the General Assembly was able to override every one of the governor's 19 vetoes this past legislative session. Why that's important is that the General Assembly passed bills, significant bills, to protect pro-life, unborn children in North Carolina, to protect parental rights, to prohibit the administration of puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones and gender surgeries on minors, to pass a bill that would require age verification for access to pornography on the website by minors, and also to save women's sports. All those bills, every one of those bills, except the age verification bill, was vetoed by the governor, and the General Assembly was able to override their veto. I'm looking at our election results from last night, looking at our state legislature. We've got 2 seats in the state Senate where there were over 120 votes cast, and the vote count difference in those 2 races is 27 votes and 38 votes. And that will determine very likely whether or not we have veto-proof supermajorities in the legislature. When Christians hear every vote counts, they need to understand that every vote counts, especially in extremely competitive battleground states like North Carolina, like Virginia, like Pennsylvania, like Georgia. And so when you hear that, take it seriously and know that your engagement, your involvement, your stepping up to be civically responsible, and even more importantly, to lean into what Jesus said that we were, or that we are, which is salt and light in the culture. We need to lean into that and take those responsibilities seriously, because they can have an impact. And it's not just on policy and political stuff. It's on issues that have a real life impact on the unborn, on the aged, on our adolescents and teens who are struggling with gender identity issues and things like that. And so these are real important issues, and every vote can make a difference. So I think that's what our real takeaway from this election is, with North Carolina having existed for many, many, many years in relative political anonymity, to now be one of the top most competitive states in the nation. This is one of the most important lessons that we've learned. And thank God that the Christian community in our state has really understood that and embraced it, and has stepped full force into making an impact on what our makeup looks like in the General Assembly and Congress. We're incidentally sending 3 additional Republican members to Congress, which we're really excited about. So, lots going on. Everything's not rosy, but with the Lord on our side and with Christians engaged, we know that we can make a big difference.
That's a good word, John. I'm just going to throw out a couple more questions before we wrap up here. And what you said about Congress kind of gets into my next question, which is, looks like conservatives won. We did win. Conservatives won the Senate, U.S. Senate. Looks like at the time we're taping this, that we are well on track to see the same thing happening in the House. So my question to throw out to all of you is, what kind of traction can we expect on a practical level on the issues we care about, on the things we've been talking about, life, family, freedom, some of these girls' sports, transgender issues? I guess I'll just lead off with you again, Cole. What do you think we can accomplish, or what kind of traction might some of these social conservative issues get?
You're going to be far more successful at the state level. Just being straight up. I mean, let's celebrate what happened from a federal, national level. Certainly, you don't have a federal government that's going to wage war against you like you would have had under a Harris regime. I think there's maybe some cause for optimism that you may see federal government action on things like puberty blockers or gender reassignment surgeries. Maybe you may see some federal government action on boys and girls sports. I think the transgender issues are the things that you're most likely to see. You could see that either from an education department standpoint or some sort of legislation. That will be tough. It's going to be a tough push, but I think that's the most likely thing that you'll see. School choice, I think, is something that you may see some federal government action on. I think that would be a huge, monumental win if you can do that. I think overall dismantling of the Department of Education would probably be the biggest conservative win you could possibly hope for out of the next 4 years. I think, one of the cautions I have to throw out is on the life issue. Your hope is that they don't do anything stupid. You're not going to see a pro-life bill pass and get to President Trump's desk and have him sign it. What you have to worry about is, does Donald Trump change his philosophy on judges? Does he now view judges and them being pro-life or perceived as pro-life as somehow less valuable or a detriment? Does he try to ram through pro-IVF legislation? Like you are not going to ban, and it would be bad messaging, bad politics to try to ram an IVF ban down, the federal government. That's not going to happen.
Covered too, yeah.
Exactly. But is Donald Trump going to try to do something proactive in favor of IVF and health insurance mandates and paying for it and all that stuff? That is a concern. You could see, despite a big win, conservatives do things that are not conservative and are against our interests. And so be wary of that. Continue to speak out from a pro-life ethos. Those are things to expect in the next 2 years. I will want to talk about 2026 at some point, but those are things that I think you can hope for and work for and pray for from a federal government action standpoint.
Can we see some of the transgender Title IX executive orders, the manipulation of those laws? Can we see that reversed? Can we at least see maybe the federal abortion even more expansive than Roe blocked? What do you guys think?
I think it's really important for us to note to what you just said, what's not going to happen. So by securing the U.S. Senate, we are now ensuring we will not have court packing from the left, for example. We will not have a filibuster destroyed and a pro-abortion something moved through. So I think equally in part of what could happen is also what has been prevented just by controlling the Senate, let alone if you get to the House. Getting to the sort of what happens in the regulatory state. This is where the Christian community needs to start praying, because these positions are filled by human beings and we want these choices to be conservative. We want people that are in all of these appointed positions in the different agencies that are going to touch these regulations to be people who understand that God made two sexes and that it matters that they are different and distinct and that we aren't playing around with ideologies. So to be seen.
Yeah, I remember, Victoria, in 2016, after that election, we were in a meeting up in D.C. And Trump had just got elected for his first term. And I remember you and several other colleagues and I were walking around the Capitol just wondering what in the world was a Trump administration going to look like. And it turned out far better than any of us could have anticipated. And it was really remarkable to see what the administration did. And now I think that same question arises anew, is what does a second Trump administration look like? Is it going to be very similar to the first? Is it going to be completely different? Hopefully in many respects, it's very similar from a policy standpoint, as far as what they do within the administration and then what issues they champion that are so important and fundamental to our causes and our hearts. So I think that's going to be really interesting to see. And certainly with on the legislative side of things, with the House Speaker, Mike Johnson, who's just done an incredibly tremendous job, just amazing job, and stepped into this role with these elections in such a big way. I think he has really built up his credibility and his profile tremendously. And, we're excited to see what his leadership is going to bring, as far as assuming the House does have a majority and he remains Speaker, what that looks like with a majority in the Senate and with a second Trump administration.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned him. That's a really good point. Well, I think I'm just going to throw out one more question here to wrap up on. And I'm really interested in how you all will respond to this because looking at the big picture over the next several years, people are saying that Trump has fundamentally changed the Republican Party, that he's attracted new voters. Is this a trend that has staying power? How are we going to keep these new voters or guide them into social conservatism? And what does this mean for the entire future for the social conservative movement? Michael, I'll start with you.
Well, there's certainly some challenges that come through this election. Some of the policy positions that President Trump has taken that divert from his historic stance, or at least his record in that first administration. So it's hard to know, whether or not this coalition that's been built will hold together because there are some competing ideas that are being brought from the different people that he's brought into this coalition, and that's going to be a challenge to handle. I guess what is on my mind is a tweet that our colleague Bob Vanderplat's put out this morning. He's been he runs the Family Leader, the Family Policy Council in Iowa, and his tweet, and Bob does these sorts of things to try to steer things in a particular direction. And he said God spared Donald Trump's life for a purpose. Let's pray that God will use him. And then he laid out very positive purposes for God to use him. And it made me think of, I think it's Proverbs 21:1, which talks about the king's heart is like a channel in the hands of the Lord. He guides it whichever way he would. And that's a call to all of us to be praying that God would use this president, this new administration, and all of the different facets to it for his purposes, for the good of family flourishing, for the benefit of our nation, for the benefit of the world. God can do that. These are flawed human beings. Every person that we elect is a flawed human being. Every one of us on this call is a flawed human being. But God can accomplish his purposes as we ask him to do that. And that's what I want to see coming forward, not manipulating it and trying to influence in the way that we might. We all have the work to do, and God has called us to occupy. But ultimately, we pray that God would use that man and the thousands of people that he appoints for his purposes to bring about family flourishing, a flourishing of our society, and glory to God.
Well said. Any other thoughts? Well, Victoria, I'm going to throw it to you to take us out on your thought for what this means for social conservatism.
Well, it's hard to imagine saying it better than Michael just did, but we need to steward well all the new voters that have come alongside a general agenda that we all agree on, right? So there have been these first-time voters, there have been these new demographics, and truly it is for us as biblical worldview Christians to really share the power in God's principles and how they work and how they build towards all human flourishing with folks who may have voted alongside of us for slightly different reasons, but are now in sort of this coalition with us. And so it's our job to kind of do that well, to not assume what they believe and not condemn what they believe, but be in a very winsome way, drawing people towards the beauty of human life, towards the value of parents being engaged in the lives of their children, towards family formation. I mean, that's really a struggle in our culture right now. This idea that marriage and family is a beautiful thing, a worthy thing, and creating policies that make that possible and make that something that people desire. So this is on us as a movement to be to lead in a very effective and godly way towards the greater good that he has laid out in God's word.
And again, what is so encouraging is that you all reflect that we have this beautiful movement through the Family Policy Alliance, these organizations that you each lead in your states, in almost every state of the union. We have these organizations that are day in and day out fighting for, biblical policies based on biblical principles that are going to strengthen the family unit, safety for kids, and human life, the sacredness of human life. And what just is encouraging to me, and I think will be encouraging to our listeners, is that we all in the state organizations, the family policy councils represented on this call, and our other sister organizations, like almost every state in the union at this point, we are doing this day in and day out, regardless of who is changing office, who is elected. That doesn't change. We're going to advocate for God's principles in the public square and policy. So I just want to encourage everybody listening to remember that we're standing behind you in that way, that we are stronger when we speak together. So we are moving forward. So just God bless all of you. We're going to be praying for the work that you are all doing on the front lines. Thank you so much for your time today. And I will just wrap up saying, if you want people to hear this viewpoint that you're not going to hear anywhere else on other kinds of media or without that biblical perspective, if you want them to hear this perspective, be sure to share this podcast. And if you want to continue to hear the updates that we're doing from week to week that impact not only Virginia, but the nation, you can subscribe to our Speak Up Virginia playlist. And we are also on audio only platforms like Apple and Spotify. So we'll see you next time. Thanks for joining us.